All right, it is noontime. Welcome to Webinar for Busy Lawyers. We're delighted to have you here. So today I'm Laura. I'm a law practice advisor at LCL, and I have the pleasure of hosting our own Dr. Tracy Myers, who's one of my colleagues on the clinical side. Before I introduce her, let me tell you a little bit about Webinar for Busy Lawyers. This is one of our services at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. If you're unfamiliar with us, we do free confidential services for lawyers, law students, judges, and legal professionals in Massachusetts. Our services include support groups, consultations, webinars such as this. If you have questions afterwards, we encourage you to reach out. In the meantime, Webinars for Busy Lawyers is about giving you some practical takeaways in a short amount of time. Today, our subject is imposter syndrome, which is something that a lot of people we know struggle with. And we are so lucky to have Dr. Tracy with us to share on this topic. Dr. Tracy has a wealth of experience. She is a fabulous clinician, and I will say to a personal note, a wonderful person all around. She's just absolutely fantastic. Among her many accomplishments is that she has recently released a book called Yin Yoga Therapy and Mental Health, which is available on Amazon. I also encourage you to seek out Dr. Tracy's yoga groups, which she does once a week, and also she does occasional mindfulness series for us. We're going to have time after the talk to go over some questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, Tracy, I will share over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for that really kind introduction. So the topic of imposter syndrome is really interesting. I find that, of course, not just for lawyers, but all of us struggle with some form of imposter syndrome, at certain times of our life. So today I'll be speaking about imposter syndrome for legal professionals, but we can expand this to think about anyone who's in a professional field and really wants to do a good job. All right, so let's begin. And as Laura said, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll save time at the end to go over them. All right, so as Laura mentioned, we're here at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and we have free and confidential clinical services in addition to the practice management side. And so we do one-on-one consultations and have several groups available if you are interested. So please check out our website. So we're going to talk today about imposter syndrome, what it is, find out what contributes to imposter syndrome, and then recognize how does it interfere with your work, and finally some practical tools. We always want to have some takeaways when we leave a seminar. Hopefully that might be effective in working on imposter issues. So all right, so here are some questions to ask yourself, and I know the answer for most of us because I'm in this ballpark. Say yes to these, but let's go over them a little bit. So agonizing over small mistakes, attributing your success to outside factors, very sensitive to criticism, feeling like you might be found out as a phony, or downplaying your experience, even in areas that you're skilled in, right? So can you relate to some of these, all of these? And as we're going to discuss, sometimes this imposter phenomenon comes in and out of our lives, especially when we're embarking on a new change, a new position, or we've received criticism. So we may not have all of these all the time, but there may be periods of time where they're more predominant. Okay, so let's talk about what imposter syndrome is, right? And I love this cartoon because many of us say, we're fine, we're doing fine. And we might come across as feeling confident and secure. But meanwhile, if someone's listening to the dialogue in our head, we have all of these negative thoughts, right? And they can go from just being, a little bit like you don't know what you're doing to you suck, right? They can be pretty hostile, our inner dialogue. So imposter phenomenon was first diagnosed or first described by two clinical psychologists in the 1970s. They talked about it as phoniness in people who believe they're not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. And this was really around women who were entering the workplace and climbing the corporate ladder. So this was really the kind of top population that they were talking about in 1978. But now we fleshed out this diagnosis, and it's actually not a diagnosis. We fleshed it out as much more of an experience, right? So initially looking at it as maybe a deficit or a problem, we can now look at it as like these are feelings that are coming from within and stemming from things like fear of rejection, fear of failure, a tendency toward perfectionism. It can affect everybody, but more likely when we're high achieving, right? Because we're coming up against potential failure. And it can range. And this is what I see across the board when I'm working with law students and lawyers, from slight feelings of inadequacy. Maybe I'm not sure how I'm doing. My performance review said I was doing okay, but, right? Like kind of slight to real extreme feelings like I am not cut out for this. I'm a fraud. I'm going to be discovered. I'm going to lose my law license, like all of those. And that continuum can range from mild to really severe. So in fact, when we talk about imposter syndrome, we're really talking about a phenomenon. And why we want to use that language, I mean, we use it interchangeably, but phenomenon suggests that it's internal rather than something wrong like a diagnosis. So here's a lawyer's description of their own internal experience. No matter how hard I work, for some reason, it never feels good enough. I tend to overachieve and stretch myself thin. I'll work long hours. I'll take on too many projects at once or absorb a heavier workload than I realistically can handle. And I never admit that I need help with a project or task. So how many of us can relate to elements of that, right? And why I wanted to really focus on that is that's a good internal dialogue, right? Nobody knows this person is feeling that, but this is what's happening inside the person. All right, so I've hinted a little bit at the causes of imposter syndrome, but I want to drum in a little bit further to look at what actually causes it. So psychologists believe that certain personality traits drive imposter syndrome. And the number one personality trait is perfectionism, right? Perfectionism, this desire to do well, to expect and demand from oneself to be perfect. Couple that with a competitive environment, and you have the chemistry that can create imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. The statistics are really high in terms of how many of us struggle with imposter syndrome. Somewhere between 25 to 30% of high achievers suffer imposter syndrome. So a third or almost. And 70% of adults experience it at some point. So nearly everybody can relate to this, whether it happened in college, grad school, law school, in the workplace. We can feel that, even as a parent, right? So imposter phenomenon, that internal dialogue, happens for most of us. Specifically for lawyers are really susceptible to imposter phenomenon. And we can see this at different parts of one's career. So new lawyers are ripe, of course, because they may feel like they have to continually prove themselves, be perfect, right? There's very little room for errors, and they have to act like they know what they're doing. You know, I've had many attorneys say, I'm afraid to ask. I'm afraid to say I don't know what I'm doing because that might look like I'm not competent. So that fear and the environment that doesn't really support a lot of questions can really create that imposter phenomenon right off the bat in a new lawyer. On the other end, senior lawyers are often trying to preserve the illusion that they know what they're doing. This idea of, I love this term, flawless practitioners, modeling for the younger associates, right? Role models. And so to admit a failure can feel really worrisome, scary, often again, like it could derail their career where they finally reached this pinnacle and it could bring them down, right? So that fear of losing what they've learned. The environment in a law firm particularly can make it very difficult. The fear of rejection, frequent comparisons to other people, or the expectations aren't clear. When someone sings your praises, and you can think about this when you've received some positive feedback, maybe there's an email or a shout out, how sometimes actually that can create more of a sense of being an imposter. Like, oh no, now everyone thinks I really know what I'm doing. Now the expectations are even higher. So sometimes that can actually increase our feelings of inadequacy. Same thing, you might have had a string of successes, but then you have a failure. So one small failure that also can really create a sense of inadequacy. Our brains tend to remember the negative, right? We have something called a negativity bias, where we could receive so many positive critiques and successes and positive affirmations, and it takes one person or one loss, one case that you lose, where suddenly you're back to feeling like you did when you started at a law firm, right? And the reason it's important to look at these is to recognize, oh, I'm in good company, I'm not alone, because this is an internal dialogue. And when we have an internal dialogue with ourselves, we often feel like we're the only one. That's actually at the heart of why it's so painful. We don't want anyone to know what we're feeling because we think we're the only ones feeling that. So by going over these, I'm hoping to normalize how common this is. You know, we all struggle with this in some way. So this is what I thought was really interesting about what particular personalities can lead to imposter syndrome. And I like this because we can kind of see where we fall into these categories. Some of us might meet several of these, but we can also, again, with humor and compassion, recognize, oh, of course, this is why it's so difficult for me. We covered perfectionists first, this idea that if you can't achieve perfection, then you feel like you fail. It's like an all or nothing. We call that in psychology a cognitive distortion, when we see things either black or white and there's no shades of gray, right? Natural geniuses, these are folks that really get things easily, right? And when they encounter a challenge, that's when it really becomes difficult. They may even feel like a fraud because things have come so easily, right? I remember my daughter, who's now in college, and she excelled in high school. And then she started taking calculus, and suddenly that challenge, she started having all the self-doubts, not just about math, but in general. I don't know if I can make it in college. It got generalized to so many different areas because she had this natural aptitude, right? Rugged individualists, like those of us who feel like I can do it on my own. I don't need help, right? And when it comes down to it and we do need help, we don't want to ask. It's so uncomfortable. And it feels like a failure. Those of us who are experts, that we learn and we dig in and we try to get so much information. And if we miss something, it can feel like a complete failure because we put so much effort in. And finally, superheroes. We expect to succeed, right? And I'm sure some of you can relate to this. You know, we work hard, we expect to succeed, take on more and more and more because that's what we do. And then maybe we feel in over our heads, right? So all of us, I think, can relate to at least one of these, if not several of these. And with compassion, recognizing, oh yeah, of course, this is why it's so hard for me. So sometimes we kind of make light of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. We kind of say, oh, well, everyone has, well, I'm saying we all struggle with that. It's so common, right? But actually, it can really have a deleterious effect on us. Number one, it can really lower our self-esteem and self-doubt. And I see this with lawyers, where people that might not want to look for a new job, even if they're really unhappy in their position, because I don't have enough experience, I don't feel like I'm qualified. I think, I don't think I'd make the partner track. So there's that self-doubt that creeps in, and that really changes our behavior. So it can impede our career growth. It can also hamper our leadership abilities, because if we have a fear that we're going to be exposed, and we talked about that in this slide, right? This idea of experts, right? And also not asking for help. So if we fear that if we are exposed, we may not want to take a leadership role, or we may be not confident because that fear of exposure might come out, right? So we either don't take on a leadership role, or we're not as confident, and maybe we are not as effective as a leader. Lack of innovation, right? If we view failure as a sign that we're actually an imposter, that we don't know what we're doing, we're not going to take on challenges, right? And we know failure. Many of us have heard that failure is so important. Expecting to fail is actually really important. Some disciplines like science, right? If we were in a lab, we'd know, oh, failure is important. That actually really helps us. But in the legal profession, failure feels like it's a black mark against us, right? And because of that, we may not take risks. And the piece that I see so much in my practice is issues with mental health. If we feel like our inner dialogue is telling us something's wrong with us, we're going to feel pretty isolated. We may not want to tell our colleagues we feel this way. We don't trust to tell, our bosses that we might need more support. So that can cause stress, anxiety, and depression. And it becomes a cycle. The more that we feel anxious or depressed, the less likely we are to take on new challenges, the less likely we're confident to stand up or, want to share a success. And that can decrease our overall job satisfaction. So it's real. The imposter phenomenon has real impact in terms of how we see ourselves and the behaviors we end up acting out from. All right, so here's the fun part. Like when we start to think about imposter phenomenon, we can think about some keys to overcoming it. Now, I don't expect in this short webinar that you're going to overcome what could be a lifetime of struggle. But I want to introduce maybe a few of these that you can start to play with. And this could be something you do on your own. This could be something you do with your loved one at home, that you kind of whisper the truth around feeling like you have some imposter phenomenon traits, or even in a therapy session or a consultation. So number one is looking at our cognitive distortions. I said this earlier around perfectionism, that one of the challenges with perfectionism is that it has like kind of a tunnel vision. It's either good or bad, perfect or a failure, right? And that's a cognitive distortion. So when we can begin to name our cognitive distortions, recognize them first, like, oh, that's actually a black or white, that's a distortion. We start to recognize that gives us more capability to challenge the distortion. But for many of us, they're operating under the surface and we're not always aware of them. So we start with awareness. What are the distortions that we may be believing that are impacting our view of ourselves? So the first is this Dunning-Kruger effect, which I really like. It's this idea that other people who look really confident may not know as much as they appear to know. And in fact, they've actually done research that people that are blazing and very confident and seem to have all the answers often are missing key pieces. Whereas people that say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, often have a lot more knowledge and they know what they don't know, right? They know what they don't know. So in fact, not knowing the answer may reflect more knowledge, a true, more balanced understanding of one's own strengths and weaknesses, right? So the people that seem most confident may not actually have the knowledge. I just want you to plug that into your mind for a moment. And that when we are less confident, this kind of unfolds from letter A, then we can say, okay, I don't know, or it depends, rather than pretending. And when we don't pretend, we start to shift the narrative from I'm faking, I don't know what I'm talking about, to, okay, it depends, or I'm not sure, and I'm going to get the information. So that's really important, to be able to say less. To be able to acknowledge not knowing and saying less specific answers and more balanced around getting the information. And then the third part, which is challenging your own thoughts, because often underneath that desire to be perfect or underneath the fear of failure, there are core beliefs, sometimes about worthiness, sometimes about approval, like I really want to be liked. I really want to be thought of with respect. And when we can acknowledge that, we recognize, of course, that's a basic human need. So underneath our cognitive distortions are basic human needs, wanting to be liked, wanting to be respected, wanting to feel approved and feel worthy, wanting to belong, right? And when we can recognize that, we can start to move away from the distortion and just acknowledge that basic desire, right? Which we all have. Why we're trying to acknowledge that and not just do this unconsciously is that gives us many more skills and options if we're able to recognize that the default of just feeling like a failure, kind of quietly hiding, doesn't necessarily help us, right? We begin to uncouple that style, and there are more options once we're able to do that. All right, so we're still under that cognitive distortions. We can learn how to rewire your brain. And there's a lot of neuroscience research around practice turning your imposter statements or any negative statement into a more evidence-based thought. So this is the heart of cognitive behavioral therapy, taking a thought that may be negative, finding a substitute and practicing it so it starts to wire together. There's this famous saying in the neuroscience world, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. So if we can continue to work on putting together positive statements, eventually they wire into a more confident network. So, for example, I'm not a good lawyer, or I'm not as good of a lawyer as I think I am. An evidence-based thought, which is based on evidence, is I'm a great lawyer. My track record proves it, right? Now that may feel really like I could never say that, but imagine just practicing this to yourself, looking at your track record. So you can find your own statements that resonate. So maybe saying I'm a great lawyer might be hard to say, but looking at your track record. I only got this far because I work hard. I'm really not that smart. And law students will say that to me all the time. Again, thinking about, of course you're smart. Of course I'm smart. I got here, right? My hard work got here. You don't get to law school. You don't pass the bar. You don't, work in a firm for X amount of years unless you have lots of intellectual capacity. Negative thought, I won this time, but next time I won't. And again, you might use a different statement. This may seem a little brash, but I've proven I'm a winner, I'll win again. So whatever works for you, but I like these ideas of using evidence-based information to change the thought. Then there's another way. So these are all different ways, and I'm going to, go through 5 or 6 different ways that you can approach imposter phenomenon or syndrome. Second is to move away from the cognitive pieces to think about a growth mindset. And this is based on the work of Carol Dweck. She talks about mindsets. I love her work because she really talks about how we can develop what she calls a growth mindset, because failure is embedded in this growth mindset. So she talks about a fixed mindset that is really static. And because of that, we avoid challenges. We don't like obstacles. We give up easy. We see effort as worthless after a period of time. Criticism makes us very anxious, and we feel threatened by the success of others. So that can be this fixed mindset, especially when we're gripped with feeling, like we're an imposter. Growth mindset really talks about learning through experience, including setbacks and failures, seeing that as part of this mindset. So making mistakes doesn't make you a fraud in this growth mindset. It actually is okay to not know something. And we can recognize that we'll have another voice that comes up that says, I can't, I have to know everything. That wouldn't cut it in my workplace. And don't challenge yourself to go back and forth. Just recognize, oh yeah, there's other mindsets. There can be a fixed mindset sometimes, and I can move toward a growth mindset, even if not in this moment, right? Because we're not always ready, or the situation may not present itself where we can take on a lot of new challenges, but just planting the seed of this idea that there's another mindset. Okay, so here's some other strategies. Focus on your strengths. So this is really an interesting challenge. Have you ever taken the time to actually write down your strengths? We tend to shy away from that. We tend to feel like, oh, that's boasting, that's too confident, that, I'm going to rest on my laurels, right? Similar to when I teach about self-compassion, how people feel like, oh, I'm letting myself off the hook. But for the purposes of this conversation, imagining taking 5 minutes to just write down things you're good at, your strengths. And when you look at those strengths, to recognize they're coming from the work you've done. I was working with an attorney the other day, and we talked about having a list of, or a file of compliments, looking at like all of the things that people thank you for, appreciate, or recognize. We often get stuck with that one email that criticized us, or that one negative performance appraisal, or the one case we lost. So having this regular file of things can be really helpful to look at, to remind ourselves, yeah, there are a lot of strengths here. And then we have this idea of a small step, just that little small step of maybe trying a new case, asking to work with someone new you haven't asked before, learning a new technique, something that you haven't explored before. That small step, that is really important in terms of this growth mindset, right? And that helps us start to see it as a path rather than this linear line of I have to keep improving over time. It's this path that has new challenges, bumps, ups and downs, but it's a pathway, right? And the path actually has a lot of value in it. So common humanity, and I hope you heard me threading this through this, presentation today, that when we recognize we're not alone, some of the tension, some of the shame that comes up around the imposter phenomenon begins to soften. We recognize, like if you looked around your work environment, 70% of people there have experienced imposter phenomenon at one point or another. 70. So that's nearly everybody in the room, everybody in the cubicles you're looking out at, everyone on Zoom on this call, right? So when we can start to talk about it honestly, we feel like we're less alone, and it makes it less real. It makes it more of it's this internal feeling that comes from perfectionism or my need to really have all the answers, right? Vulnerability, which feels like it's the opposite of what we want to do, but vulnerability can help. Actually asking for feedback instead of waiting for this inevitable terrible feedback that we're so fearful of, to ask for feedback at regular intervals. Then it becomes less scary, number one, and two, we can actually improve. It goes back to that growth mindset that if we get used to getting some corrective feedback, and it has to be done well, it has to be in a situation where you have someone that will give you what I like to think about as sandwich feedback, right? So we have bread, which is like the top layer, which is positive, the meat, which is something to work on, and then the other slice, which has like some compassionate, value statement. But we want to get feedback so that we can continue to grow. And when we continue to grow, we start to move away from that internal experience of not being good enough. The comparisons are so different. It's so hard, right, to avoid comparisons. But again, over time, to recognize this person next to me has their strengths and weaknesses. And when people compliment you, to let yourself feel that. Maybe even saying it a few times to yourself, sharing it with a loved one when you get a compliment. And then the final piece is focusing on others, really helping others in the same situation, a new associate, a law school colleague. When we help other people, it taps into, we're all in this together, and we can find that common humanity. Remember, at the heart of imposter phenomenon is often isolation and shame. I'm alone, I'm going to be exposed. If I help someone else, if we share our vulnerabilities, that intensity, the power of that starts to diminish. And then, we can use technology too, because sometimes imposter phenomenon is exacerbated by timelines, time management, difficulty getting things done, right? So, this idea that we can use our technology to help us stay on track, and that helps us feel more effective, which can help us reduce some of those internal negative thoughts about how good of a job or how bad of a job we might be doing, right? So that does matter. Time management matters. So that's one of the things to look at in your own routine. When you're feeling negative about your performance, is it related to productivity or some time management tasks that you need some more assistance on? Often we don't relate imposter phenomenon to that, but that can play a role as well. So I'm going to stop here and see if anyone would like to share any questions or comments about imposter phenomenon, or share any insights you may have if you've had success in developing a growth mindset.
Tracy, this was wonderful. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I want to share two things to start us off, because I know sometimes it can be hard to be the first one to ask a question.
Sure.
So first, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a program that you did. It's on our LCL website on practices for self-compassion in the legal profession. Dr. Tracy has so many gifts of expertise, and the self-compassion and mindfulness and breathing is something that's really helped me. I'll share too, I've been one of the very, very many people who have struggled with imposter syndrome at other times. As you said, just recognizing everyone has different strengths and that skills take so much just time and effort to build upon. Let's say that you're looking at experience-based and you just lost a recent case.
Mm.
That's okay. Think back then to you had a case before you did well, or you did well with a deposition. As you say, if you can go back into evidence thinking rather than just the negative thoughts in your head, I think that that really can help you stay more objective. Um,
Yeah, yeah. It is interesting how we don't use evidence-based thinking when we are gripped with shame and self-doubt. We actually go to what we think about as a default network in our brain, which is often there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. These core, what we call core negative beliefs. And so many of us have these, and they're often the same, Laura, like same beliefs, that I have, you have, doesn't matter in what field we're in. We struggle with those. And it's like, oh, well, if everyone struggles with that, then maybe it's not something wrong with me. And like just beginning to recognize, oh yeah, other people have that too.
And as you say, that relates back to the common humanity. I loved all of the tips you took us through and how just recognizing so many people have this, the common humanity, as well as skills you can work on, whether time management or mindset. You really gave us some powerful takeaways, Tracy.
Oh,
Well,
oh yeah. I see. Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
yeah, and I see we have a question who has come in. This is great. Other people have questions. Feel free to put them in Q&A or in chat. This person says fighting imposter syndrome or phenomenon is can be very draining. It's easy to want to give up. How do you work on sustaining it? It's a great question. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I feel compassion. I always like start because I feel compassion in your question too. It's draining and it takes a lot of work. Yeah. So, I do start with self-compassion as sort of the entryway of recognizing that it's painful because this is not something that's easy. We can kind of make light of it because so many people struggle with it. It's tossed around a lot, but it is painful. So first acknowledging like this does take a lot of effort and it's hard. When we start to bring self-compassion to our experience, then we can begin to actually bring like care to ourselves. So that's the first thing of like, what would help me to feel more at ease? For me, when I'm working with clients, often we talk about having options. When we're stuck in imposter syndrome, we feel like I could never get a different job. I have no options. So often I work with lawyers on this idea of like, what are options for growth? Maybe right now you're not going to look for another job, but maybe you're going to do an additional training. You're going to learn a new technology. But the idea of introducing growth, and it could even be unrelated to the job altogether. Maybe it's actually working on painting or something, right? But that idea of a growth mindset can help us move from this place of distress to feeling better. And when we feel better, then we have more options. So sometimes it's actually moving away from what is causing the distress and moving toward what nourishes and supports us. Let's see. William, do you see any of these suggestions relating to our interfacing with IFS work? Well, you asked a question that I love. So those of you who may not be familiar with what William's asking, IFS stands for Internal Family Systems. And it's a type of therapy and coaching that's really popular, one that I really like to practice as well, looking at different parts of ourselves. This idea that we have different parts of ourselves, right? We might have a perfectionistic part. We might have a critical voice inside of us. We might have a part of us that feels really alone and distressed. So William's question, in a therapy session or working with a coach, sometimes we can work on helping some of these parts feel more whole, more healthy, more in integration. Because for many of us, we can get kind of stuck between two parts. We can have a critical part and a part that gives up, right? So the idea of like bringing all of the parts to the table can be a really effective way to work on imposter syndrome and other painful emotional places that can happen in the workplace. So thank you for bringing that up, William. I absolutely recommend internal family systems as a modality for therapy. All right, let's see. So Ray, I joined the seminar to learn more about imposter syndrome. I keep hearing about it. I've been pleasantly surprised. Oh, thank you. Yeah, exactly. And thank you so much, Ray, for your point. Like these are tips about really just feeling better and creating a growth mindset, which we all can benefit from. Even if we don't, struggle with that sense of not being good enough in the workplace, all of us can get stuck sometimes in a fixed mindset and need a little tune up, a little bit of like work on what would make me feel, more motivated or feel like I'm moving in a positive direction. All right, let's see. Michelle, how do you counteract someone telling you that saying things like, I'm not sure, or I don't know, but I'll check and get back to you makes you look like you're not confident? Yes. And instead, I should respond definitively. It's a battle I'm having with my boss. I can relate to many things in the presentation. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah. So that's a little bit of the culture, right? So here we rub up against the law culture where like asking for help or saying I'll get back to you is looked at as a problem. And it is a challenge. And I think maybe working with your boss, for example, on what are other ways to be able to acknowledge that there's more information that needs to be had. So maybe saying I don't know or I'm not sure, maybe that particular phrase doesn't look confident in a particular setting, but there may be ways to say I'm going to confer or I have some additional resources that I would like to check into. So it may be the way it's said, maybe phrases that could be implemented that still get that point across that there are lots of other people that can add additional information. I also like to talk about this idea of a team approach. We can't be experts in everything, even though some of our perfectionistic thoughts really want us to do that. But this idea of like, there are going to be people that have so much knowledge in these particular areas. And so we're so lucky to have Laura on our staff because she knows so much about technology and law practice support. And so I would not try, to help a client. I would want Laura to work with them. So that idea of, really recognizing people's strengths on the team might help with that piece too. But it is a hard one, Michelle, and you're right. Sometimes people really feel like the image that it gives off doesn't fit with what we're trying to do.
I'll add on briefly to that, Tracy. I think you hit the nail on the head with how it's worded. If rather than just saying, I don't know, maybe if you can say something like, well, my inclination is this, but I need to do some research or I'm going to confer with X person who has more expertise in this area.
Yeah.
Maybe if you give an inclination, here's what I'm starting to think about, but I'm going to give more information because I want to confirm before I tell you an answer and then find out later, ooh, we didn't consider something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people really, actually appreciate that, clients, et cetera. But I absolutely get what Michelle's point is around how the perception, what that might look like in terms of, management. Yeah. I like that suggestion though, Laura. Um, Another question. I do. Okay. Yeah. Here's a really important question. So I know that failure can be an important learning tool, but I don't know how to say, oh, it's okay. I lost a case. I've won others when that case was a removal case and my asylum client is going to be deported, possibly to their death. It feels like there's only room for perfection. Yeah. So immediately I have like this compassionate response to that. Like, yes, I hear that. And when these life or death situations are on the line, absolutely. Like that is not a time to challenge the perfectionism, right? Because there's so much on the line. And when we're looking at like this whole imposter phenomenon, we're not trying to say that it should take away our edge or that we become almost like lackadaisical about losses. And there are times where perfection, think about a surgeon, right? Like we want our surgeon to be a perfectionist. We don't want them, we'd rather them not have great bedside manner if they're a perfectionist. So there are times where having that razor sharp acumen and understanding is required. And so that absolutely meets the demands, right? But there are so many situations where we don't have to do that. And if we lump them all in, that's what can cause this ongoing fear, isolation, depression, anxiety. So we want to see if we can not generalize from that very specific important case where you have to be right on point to everything in our lives. And that's what happens. Our brains tend to wire those patterns together. So if we can at least identify there are areas where I can have a growth mindset and there are areas where I have to be right on point. So thank you for bringing that up. That is absolutely an important piece of this too. Okay, John says, how do we respond to people who want to make judgments of our professional ability based on conformance to their own political or social beliefs, such as their beliefs about vaccinations? Yeah, it gets so tricky, right? If what we're saying impacts how someone judges us, we're going to be super careful not to like share, right? So I want to say something about vulnerability here. In this slide, I talked about vulnerability as being a very helpful thing when we're trying to feel like we're not alone. But there are times where being vulnerable is not wise. And like to your point, if people are going to judge us, or we're getting into a topic where you can see someone might have very rigid beliefs and values, then that's where that boundary is really important. So sometimes setting those boundaries of knowing I'm not even going to go wade into that territory. I like to practice what I call my scripts, which are a series of very vague or very non-committal or just moving something off topic, right? It's like, yeah, that's a tough topic, or that's a difficult one, or whatever, kind of those phrases where we're not going to be vulnerable, where our boundaries are going to be really like, oh, I don't, that's not relevant to what we're talking about today. So that your point is really, important for us to consider our boundaries when we're disclosing, and who we disclose our feelings to, so that safety, is in place. If we're not feeling safe, we're certainly not going to want to work on being open to people. I got fired for saying, I don't know, let me check too many times. The partners decided I wasn't confident. I've yet to overcome that emotionally. It was devastating. Yeah. Again, just so much compassion, right, for that workplace. And, as we're talking about today, and you're hearing like this mixed kind of with your colleagues on this call, this mixed back and forth of like, is it okay to do that because we can have a boss like yours, right? And then this recognition of how important it is to check and get consensus and have team people that you can go to. So I'm so sorry. That sounds awful, right? And, when we have that situation, it just reinforces that imposter syndrome, right? It's like, how do I work with that? Because that work environment just did the very thing I was really afraid of, And so I just wanted to validate that experience. And that is really, really painful when that happens. And, again, this idea of this growth mindset too. So it's both. It's not an either or. It doesn't mean that there's still not opportunities for growth, but I hear you that it takes a ton of work to get over something like that. Imposter syndrome stems from the idea that I can't do it like others. What are some ways that someone can discover their own talents that are of equal or more value than others? Yeah, I love that question, Tasha, because I think about talents are so broad. And I really am like in awe. I have a friend who's taking a watercolor class. That's why I brought up the other day. And she's a computer programmer. So I was like, you're doing watercolors, right? And she's really, really good. And she's been showing me her work, and she wasn't confident at all, but she's actually super good. Like I keep telling her how good she is because she can't quite hear it. But it's like been a game changer for her. This just different offshoot from her computer programming job, different people in her art class. And what she's recognizing is like she had this talent inside of her that she never let that come out. So I really like this idea of looking at places in addition to our workplace, like where, and sometimes then that can come back into the workplace. A very brief personal share, I've been practicing yoga and meditation for years, and someone at my job asked me to teach a yoga class. And I was like, I can't do that. Oh my God. Like totally did not want to do that. And then I did do that. I kind of overcame my fear. So I took an interest or an area that was very outside of my day job and brought it into my workplace. So I think like that idea of like, what gives me pleasure? What do I like shine at that may not even be related to my peers, Thank you for asking that question.
Tracy, I'll add on briefly 2 things for that. On our website, we have a career development workbook series. Part of it is identifying your strengths, if you want to go to it for that. I would also encourage, just like Tracy's friend did for her, if you reach out to friends and people who know you well, they'll often be able to see your strengths and your talents in a way that you yourself may not recognize. So I would check in with people, your friends, people that your neighbors you've worked with, and ask them too for their ideas on some of your strengths.
Okay, a couple more questions. Catherine was saying she has a very loud, critical voice. It makes her want to run away from herself. She appears confident, but then feels inside like a loser or fake, right? Just like kind of what we're talking about today. and that she's quiet by nature and afraid to speak up. Yeah, definitely. And I'm like nodding to all the things you're saying, Catherine. Sometimes when I speak up, I kick myself for doing so. I feel like I sounded stupid, or I sound like I couldn't be honest enough. Yeah, I'm not confident at all to appear to be, so I'm afraid to fail. Yeah. So what I want to say again is we can relate. I'm sure if you asked people on this call, how many of us have a loud critical voice that makes us want to run away from ourselves sometimes? And I would tell you that all of us do. We are wired to have this critical voice. It can keep us out of trouble. It can keep us on the straight and narrow, and it can be very cruel to us. It can be harsh. And so, often we do need to work with a counselor, a therapist, like we talked about that model earlier of internal family systems or self-compassion, because that voice could be so loud and so harsh that it can really derail us. And so I would just say to you, Catherine, you're not alone. Many of us have that kind of an internal voice, and there's help. It's a great opportunity to work on that. It can be liberating to start to find a little bit more compassion and some different ways to talk to ourselves. So thanks for sharing that. John said, remembering boundaries without sounding evasive or lacking compassion and empathy is difficult. Any thoughts on connecting those neurons? Oh, I love your question, John. So there's a whole, I'm all animated because this is such a topic that I love. There's a whole idea around something called fierce compassion, which is that we can actually be compassionate and have good boundaries. In fact, that's a way of being compassionate, is setting boundaries. It can feel like, oh, that's being harsh, or that's being evasive, or that's being selfish to create boundaries. But there's a real kind of emerging field of research around what we call fierce compassion. Kristen Neff, who does a lot of research on self-compassion, she actually has a book out right now called Fierce Compassion, which is this idea of sometimes setting a boundary because I'm protecting myself is a form of compassion. Saying no, not letting someone walk all over us, being able to be honest. Those are all ways that we can have fierce compassion. So in fact, we are going to connect a pattern when we set compassionate boundaries for ourselves. We are creating a healthier nervous system. So thank you. That's a great question. You guys have awesome questions today. I'm so grateful for these thoughtful questions and ideas. All right. So I think that's it, Laura. Anything else? Oh, good. And Laura's been giving us some links as well. Thank you.
I was just going to link also. I agree. These questions have been wonderful, and Dr. Tracy, how you've been answering them is so compassionate and helpful and thoughtful. Thank you so much. I was just going to try to link also. You had written some articles and done a past webinar for us on managing different emotions, difficult emotions, which I think would be helpful for this audience as well. And I also want to note that if you, want to work more, Dr. Tracy, she also does the webinar or yoga for busy legal professionals, which is every week. I believe it's Thursdays at 2:00 now. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yep.
And she also helps run the Supermoms group, both of which are wonderful. I'm just putting in here, I think I found the link. Her past presentation on managing difficult emotions in the workplace. And also we'd had a past webinar on setting boundaries to improve your well-being as a lawyer, which I think will help play in to one of those questions as well. Great. So it looks like we have addressed everyone's questions. Oh, sorry. Yes, we're having John asked Fierce Compassion by Kristen. I'll try to find the link for that. Would you?
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, let me do that now. So self-compassion, let me get to this website. So this is a website I go to often. This is all about self-compassion from Dr. Kristen Neff. And she is a wonderful researcher and does all sorts of work with self-compassion research and talks about this fierce and tender sides of compassion, and she talks about boundaries as well. So that's her work, and she's got really helpful research links and podcasts and other things there too. And
That is,
her last name is Neff, so it's Kristen Neff.
and oh, thank you so much, Tracy. We also had in the chat that Michael recommends Adam Grant has a chapter in Think Again on imposter syndrome that he
Okay.
will.
Thank you. Good.
Also note, James wrote in, thank you, excellent and relatable presentation. Thank you so much, James. And John has a response to one of the other questions before. He notes maybe being terminated from the firm that demanded snap responses was a blessing and might have saved the career. He received a call this morning from a person who's suffering from another attorney's incomplete planning advice. You know, that is a great point as well. I will say too, I have learned over my career, just as Tracy said, those that will say, you know what, let me look into this and get back to you, are often not only more thoughtful with their planning, but usually seen as more credible. Those that will give an incomplete, answer right off the top of their head just to give something in the moment, but aren't sure of it, it usually, comes out later. So I will just note too that as he notes, maybe it was a blessing that you were able to move on to a hopefully better workplace. So I think that is all. I want to note that for our next webinar for busy lawyers will be on December 14th, and it will be with Mala Rafiq and Heidi Alexander on health insurance for solo and small firms. So we're looking forward to that. I want to thank you all again for your time and being with us today. And as noted, if you want to follow up for other LCL services, we welcome that. Dr. Tracy, this was absolutely wonderful talk, so helpful and relatable. I encourage people again to check out not only her yoga group, but also her book on Amazon. And she's really has a lot of expertise in yoga and mindfulness. And Dr. Tracy, I want to turn it over for you for some closing thoughts for us today.
Yeah, so I just really want to thank everyone. This is a sensitive topic, as we're talking about, that can bring up, lots of challenging feelings and emotions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us at LCL, clinicians. All of us work one-on-one also with lawyers. So if you're struggling, like some of the respondents just indicated some pain and distress, it can be very helpful to get additional support. So feel free to do that. And I really appreciate all of you attending and talking and contributing to this topic. So thank you, Laura, for doing a wonderful job moderating and sharing resources. Really, your compassion is shown in all the things you're offering us. So I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. So glad. And just one final thing, we had someone who asked again about the upcoming webinar on health insurance. I put that in the chat as well. In case, William, you're not able to access the chat, it's December 14th. It'll be at noon. And so we look forward to having you join us then. And thank you again, everyone, for taking your time to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.